Hey folks, welcome to the Do-It-Yourself Dad channel. Today we're starting a new series on the channel that we're going to call Shop Talk, and it is exactly that. We are out here in the shop and we are going to be talking about a different kind of subject each time, a different skill, a different tool, something along those lines. We're still going to have our normal build and project and how-to videos on the channel, but we're going to try to get these out about every week, maybe a little bit more often. Right now is kind of strange times. We're in the middle of the quarantines and all that of the year 2020. So if you're watching this video in the future, that's what's going on now. I'm hoping after we get all these going and things return to normal that we're going to be able to have guests on the show and whatnot. But right now, today, we're going to be talking about soldering. And I have some solder supplies out here. I'm going to go over what we've got, what I use, what you need to start soldering, and some little tips and tricks here. Now, soldering to a lot of people seems really intimidating. You look at all this stuff, you look at things like this, and if you've never done soldering before, it can be an intimidating thing, but it doesn't have to be any more complicated really than using a hot glue gun. If you can use one of these, you can use this stuff. So let me show you what we've got here on the table. Now coming over here, this is more of your high-end soldering iron setup. It's got a variable temperature here and it's got interchangeable tips. This is nice to have if you're doing a lot of soldering, if you've got to get in places and you need to change that temperature. Depending upon what you're soldering and what kind of surface you're going to, temperature might be an issue. Something that I really think everybody should consider when they're soldering is some sort of a stand like this. When you're soldering, you have two wires that you've got to hold together and hold still. Then you've got some sort of a soldering iron that you've got to hold, and usually you have to hold some solder as well. That's four things to hold, and you've only got two hands. So something like this with little grabbers where you can hold the wires together with those and then get in there, that's a huge help. Coming over here, I've got wire strippers, and these are two different kinds. This is a wire stripper with a crimper if you're using crimp-on connectors. We'll have those in another episode, so be sure to subscribe because we're gonna have a lot of cool content coming out. These are okay. I don't really like them. These do a lot of things well, but nothing great. These are dedicated wire strippers. I use these. These do a terrific job stripping the insulation off the wire, and we'll show you in a little bit why you need to do that. And then you have the more basic soldering iron. This does not have a variable temperature, and a soldering gun. Some of the soldering guns have triggers. This one does not. And then over here, we have an alternative to soldering. These are these little heated connectors, and we're gonna have another show on these coming up. It'll probably actually be our next show. I'm also not a big fan of these. They serve their purpose, but I think this is gonna be much better and more versatile than a box of these things. So let's get into what you need to start soldering. Now, what you're gonna need a soldering iron of some sort. You're going to need flux, and we're gonna get into what all this stuff is. Solder, some sort of a wire stripper, and then you're gonna need either electrical tape or shrink tubing. And I was just looking around to see what you could get all this for. Now, a solder system like this can be really expensive. You can pay over $100 just for the soldering iron itself. But you can pick up one of these with all that other stuff for 17 bucks right now online. I've got a link for that below. So if you're getting into soldering, or if you just think you might want to try it, you can get everything you need in the kit for 17 bucks, which really is a great deal. So let me show you out of the box what you're gonna need to do. The very first thing before you start soldering any wires together is you need to prep your soldering iron, and that is tinning the tip. So I'm gonna show you real quick how to tin the tip of the soldering iron. The reason you wanna do that is you want a coating of solder on the tip. It helps transfer the heat out, and it prevents your tip from getting oxidized. So let me show you how to tin the tip of your soldering iron. So we've got our soldering iron here, and before you do anything else, you want to make sure that the tip of this thing is cool, and make sure your soldering iron is not only turned off but unplugged. And you can see here we have a nice cold soldering iron. Now we've got our flux here, and we just talked about flux. What flux does is this stuff does two things. It helps the solder flow, which means it helps it move through the joint you're working on, but it also helps protect the part from becoming oxidized when you heat it up. So what we're gonna start is we're gonna start by getting a little bit of flux here on the tip of our soldering iron. And we wanna get a nice even coating all the way around. Make sure the whole thing, all the way down to the base, has been coated. So now with that coated, the next thing we wanna do is get a length of solder. And you want to get a pretty good length because we're going to be wrapping the entire tip of the soldering iron with it. So we're going to start down here, and we are going to wrap all the way from the base of the soldering iron to the to the tip. And we can come back with another layer. So you can see here now we've got our entire soldering iron tip covered with solder. Now we can heat up the soldering iron, but make sure, because it's going to drip something, to put something underneath your soldering iron to catch it, something that you don't mind getting hot metal on. So we're going to be going a little hipster here. We've got our mason jar lid, and we're going to hold the soldering iron right over that lid. And you want to hold the soldering iron so it is level. You don't want the solder to run this way or come off it that way. And we're going to turn on our soldering iron, and we're going to allow it to start heating up. And as it heats up, you will start to see the solder here starting to melt, and it will take a little bit of time. And you'll see the solder starting to melt. And as it melts, it'll actually adhere itself. It'll tin the tip of that soldering iron. So there you go. We've got a properly tinned tip, and you can see here, if you've got a nice puddle and you can put the tip of it in the puddle and it attracts to it, you've got a nicely tinned tip. And you can even hold it in the puddle a little bit longer if you want to make sure you've got a really well tinned tip. If it starts coming up with the tip like that and drawing up to it, that's when you know you've got it properly tinned tip. Now, a lot of soldering iron tips will say that they've been pre-tinned. I would not trust that. I would still go and re-tin the tip yourself just to make sure you've got a really nice tinning job done there. So with that, we are ready to start soldering it. So we're going to start off with this little bit of green wire here, and we're going to cut it in the middle. And this is a common thing you're going to come across, where a wire has been cut or broken, and now we've got to solder the two ends back together. So you're going to start with your wire strippers. You're going to come in here and strip off the ends of that wire. So now you've got the copper inside of the wire exposed, and we're going to do that to both sides. Now there's two kinds of pretty common splices here to use. One of them is you would just push the two pieces of wire together and you would solder that. Now the problem with that is they don't really hold themselves together that well. This is really useful if you're inside a situation where it's very hard to twist them, but ideally you want to get them together like this and then twist the two wires together. So now the wires are nice and twisted together, and now is when that little clamp comes in handy. We're going to put the wires in the clamp, just like so. And now the wires themselves are being held together, but we're not having to hold them with our hands. Now, when you look at how you've got them crimped together, you do want to inspect that a little bit, because you want to make sure you don't have any wires poking out, because those wires poking out will later on wind up poking through your insulation, and you don't want that. So right now we're going to just show you the basics of soldering, and then we're going to show you how to do insulation. So now that we've got our flux in place, we've got our soldering iron, and we've got our little spool of solder here in our hand. You want to get a little bit of lead of solder. You don't need that much to do something like this. And you're going to touch the soldering iron to the bottom of the wire. Then touch the solder to the top. And you'll notice when you do that, the solder flows through all the spools of the wire. Now remember earlier I had mentioned you are touching the soldering iron to the wire and then the solder to the wire. You're not touching these two together and globbing it on there. So this is the process of getting a good solder joint. When the solder flows all the way through and it's shiny, that's called a hot solder. You don't want a cold joint. A cold joint is if you're just globbing it on there. So with that, the last thing we have to deal with is insulation. And there's two ways to insulate this. You can either wrap it in electrical tape or you can use shrink wrap. I really like using shrink wrap because it won't unwind on itself later on. One thing to remember when you're putting shrink wrap over a joint like that is you want to wait until the joint is cool, because if you put it over it while it's hot, heat shrinks the shrink wrap, you can't slip it all the way over. So we're going to pull off one side, run that little piece of shrink tubing down, get it all the way over the joint, and now all you need is a heat source. Now, some people use a cigarette lighter, some people will use a heat gun. You can even use the side of your soldering iron if you want. Don't use the tip. Use the side up here, it's hot. You can run it back and forth. And now you've completed your soldered joint. You've got your heat shrink tubing on there, so you've got this nice watertight seal around it, and you've got a nice, properly done soldered joint. So if this video helped you out at all, hit that subscribe button down below. If you are interested in seeing these guys, these are these little solder seal connectors where you don't need to use a soldering iron, you just use a heat source. I'm gonna have those in the next video, so be sure to hit subscribe if you wanna see that one come out. And of course, thanks a lot for watching.